Buenos días a todos. Those are the only words I know in Spanish. I'm very sorry. Perdono, non hablo español. Entiendo un poquito and I have to switch to English. Sorry for that, but I hope to be clear enough, and I'm sure our translator will be perfect in doing translation. So first of all, I'd like to thank very much people hosting me here, in particular Chantal, Elodie, and Macarena. They've been wonderful. You have a wonderful country. We have been very, very well here. We've been around for a while. And I'm very happy that you decided to organize those educational or scientific festivals, because I think increasing knowledge is the only way to preserve your country and to preserve your heritage. And I'm very, very pleased that we have you have an alliance, Puerto de Ideas have an alliance with Bergamo Scienza, which is another science festival. I'm involved in a little town close to Milan in Italy, and therefore I think that joint forces is the best way for increasing knowledge and for making society more equal and solidarity based. So thank you very much again for being here. And let's start with my talk. I will tell you a little bit about the brain, how the brain is made and how the brain is functioning. So first of all, I would like to tell you something about the environment, because probably not all of you knows about that we are the environment where we live. And to give you an idea of that, we contain in our body 1 quadrillion of microorganisms. 2 kilograms of our body weight is made by microorganisms, which are an essential part of our body. In fact, those microorganisms exert, as this is better, yes, sorry for that. So microorganisms living in our body exert more or less 20,000 different functions, so they are essential for us to live. So this means that we are symbiont. We live in a sort of symbiotic relationship with the environment, and this is necessary. However, the environment is not always beneficial to some extent, because there are about 13 million people dying per year in the world due to infectious diseases. And even more importantly, the environment could be very dangerous and harmful. You know this much better than me. I'm very sorry of what happens to your land last week. But you know, the environment is unpredictable. The environment it's essential for us to live properly, but at the same time could be harmful. Therefore, what we did during evolution is to develop a system which allows us to defend from the environment on one end, but to take also advantage at the same end of the environment. And during evolution, we have developed a system which was aimed properly to make us able to defend from enemies, to look for food, and to reproduce ourselves. This is evolution. And the system we developed is based on cells. Our body is made by cells, which are the building blocks of living organisms. And cells are special living matter characterized by a life cycle, because cells born, grow, divide, age, and die. Exactly what we do. That's the reason why they are the essential part of our body. And therefore, just to summarize this first part, which to me is essential to elaborate more about the brain later on, we can say that the interaction between living organisms and the environment can cause severe body injuries. So the cells, which are the building blocks we are made about, reconstruct the part of the body which are unpredictably damaged by the harmful environment. And this is the way why we have been made by cells. We are made by cells. So cells guide the regeneration of tissues in the body, and this is possible because the cells can proliferate, can generate a progeny, can generate daughter cells. So when the environment destroys some of the cells, in each of the tissues of our body, cells duplicate, make daughter cells, and reconstruct the part of the body that have been damaged. You probably do not know, but we produce 25 million new cells per second. We change our skin every month, so we produce 500 million skin cells per day. So ladies, don't do cosmetic treatments you don't need for skin. Just let the nature doing what it can do. So cell cycle is also a way to prevent cells to divide indefinitely, because you could think of cells dividing indefinitely. There's no reason to produce new cells, but this is important because cells which are endlessly dividing are tumor cells. So cells should die at certain time points, should become old and die, otherwise they transform into tumor. So this is another important question. Death is an essential part of life. Life could not exist without death, okay? Otherwise we would die, every one of us would die by tumors. So, but the question now is, since our body is in interaction between ourselves, our cells, and the environment, how can we distinguish between what is good for us and what is bad for us? How can we distinguish which are the microorganisms we have to keep into our body and which are the microorganisms we have to fight? And for this reason, there are some cells in our body that constitute the so-called immune system, which you know probably because it is formed by antibodies, white cells, lymphocytes, which are more common terms. And the immune system is the system of the body which is able to recognize what is good and what is bad for our body. In particular, we say that the immune system is able to recognize what is self and what is non-self. And this is important to keep the integrity of our body. How the immune system is able to discriminate between self and non-self, that's a very simple. I mean, it was not simple until it was discovered, of course, but every cell has on its own membrane a sort of fingerprint, a sort of receptors and antennas, which make the cells very peculiar. Every one of us has a different antennas and receptor, which are collectively called HLA, or histocompatibility complex. And as you know, maybe when we have to do an organ transplantation, we have to find for a compatible donors. This means that these donors possess tissues with those molecules which are similar to the recipient of the transplant, and therefore this makes the transplant possible. And this is because if you use cells which are different in terms of HLA molecules on their surface, they fight each other, okay? They are rejected. So those are fingerprints which make cells recognizable by our system and make cells capable of staying within our body. But sometimes things go wrong, and sometimes there are this harmful environment which hits tissues of our body, and what happens is that this kind of enemies entering into our body cause stress. Stress is not the word you know, but stress, it's a term which was introduced by Walter Cannon in 1932 as a way of defining a cell which is not anymore in equilibrium. A cell which is threatened by any enemy, it's a stressed cell. It's an alerting signal for the body that something is going wrong and that something should be defeated, should be eliminated, okay? So when stress comes, the next step is that inflammation comes. So if the body is not able to avoid the stressful, avoid the enemy, avoid the danger signal, inflammation occurs. And again, inflammation is a protective feature of a living organism. Inflammation is a protective reaction which is aimed to eliminate a danger signal. Otherwise, we think this is not the case because, you know, we are taking anti-inflammatory drugs for everything, and we don't need anti-inflammatory drugs because we need anti-inflammatory drugs only in situations in which you have high fever, because you can be dehydrated, okay? Not to fight inflammation per se, because inflammation is good for us. It's the way we use to fight enemies which are threatening our body. But since, you know, drug companies are selling tons of anti-inflammatory drugs, we think, or they made us thinking that we need to use those drugs every time, but this is not the case, okay? So inflammation is a beneficial process which at the beginning eliminates cells which are stressed and then reconstruct the tissue. Of course, sometimes inflammation is not able to reconstruct tissue. It enters into a sort of vicious cycle and becomes chronic, and at that time, of course, is dangerous for the body. But inflammation per se is beneficial. Of course, if the body cannot eliminate the stressful danger signal, if the body cannot mount an appropriate inflammatory response, the tissue is damaged. And at that time point, we need cells dividing to provide new cells to substitute the cells which have been lost. And here stem cells come, because stem cells are very special cells that we have in all tissues of our body, which represent a sort of reservoir of cells which are ready to go whenever we need new cells to substitute cells which have been lost. So this is the powerful of stem cells as a therapeutic weapon, because they are regenerating cells. They are able to regenerate every part of the body, in theory, although it's not so easy. Stem cells, why stem cells are so important and why they are a sort of infinite source of cells? Because they are special cells that divide in a very strange manner. They divide asymmetrically. This means that when they divide, they generate two daughter cells, one of which is identical to the mother cells. So the number of stem cells does not change, is always the same. So the reservoir does not exhaust. Okay? That's the reason why stem cells are so important. And therefore, with stem cells, which is sort of a manufacturing company we have in all our tissues, we are able to reconstruct the cells which have been damaged by the harmful environment. I hope to be clear enough. If I'm not clear enough, just throw me things or whatever you prefer. Okay, so, but this part of the story is absolutely necessary to go on with the brain story. Okay, so we are a symbiont. Our body's is made by cells and microorganisms coming from the outside. Those two things are necessary to be together in a symbiotic relation to make our body living properly. Unfortunately, not everything which is environment is okay. Sometimes environment is damaging our body, but we have a system, the immune system, to recognize the damaging feature first, and the stem cell system to build up what the stressful or damaging event might cause. Okay? So, let's come to the brain now, which is I hope, the most interesting part of the story I'd like to tell you. So the brain knows the environment through the five senses. We knew it already. We have been listening yesterday, Zucker talking about it. But it would be nice, I think, to tell you a little bit more about the brain, how the brain is made, how the brain works. And a little bit of history, because the brain is a very old word. The very first time that the word brain was discovered was in the ancient Egypt. There is a papyrus which is called the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus, which is dated 1862, which was bought by Edwin Smith, an English archaeologist in Egypt, from Mustafa, which was a carpet seller. And Edwin Smith found written on this papyrus 7 times the word brain, which was this kind of word. And he realized that these written letters were referring to people that during work damaged their skull, and there was a sort of substances, very, I don't know, very liquid substance coming out from the skull because of the fracture, and they called that substance brain. But Egyptian, and probably the papyrus can be dated back 3,000 years before Christ, so it's very, very old. This means that we know about the brain from 5,000 years, more or less. But Egyptians do not care too much about the brain. In fact, when they mummified people, they were used to take out brain from the nose and leave the heart within the chest, because they thought that the soul, the mind, was in the heart. And this was a discussion that went on for years and years and years among mostly philosophers, because the discussion was what is the brain, what is mind? And nobody could accept that the mind was part of the brain, which is now clear. I hope no one of you would challenge this kind of way of thinking, because we know now that the mind is in the brain, because when we damage the brain, we lose our mind at the same time, which is the most evidence that this is the case. So after the discovery of the brain as a tissue, it took several years to understand how the brain works, how the brain is structured, how the brain functions. And I would not go through all of these historical moments, but I would tell you a few things, which are the most important one. The first one is the discovery in 1861 by Paul Broca of an area in the brain which was called later on Broca areas, which is devoted to speech production. Why this was a crucial discovery? Because there was, the story is quite nice, because this person entered into the emergency room at La Salpêtrière in Paris saying only 2 words, which were tam-tam. He couldn't say anything but tam-tam. In fact, he was called tam-tam. His name was Le Borgne. And Paul Broca was the neurologist attending the emergency room at that time, and he took care of this tam-tam. At the end, tam-tam died, and Paul Broca made an autopsy, and he discovered that he could say only tam-tam because he had a damage in this area, which was called later on, as I told you before, Broca's area. And therefore, it was the first time that a cognitive function, which is language, so a superior function which was attributed to mind, was exactly within the tissue. Was the very first time in which mind was discovered to be part of the brain tissue. Okay, that's the reason why this, at least to me, was the most pivotal discovery, which was done during the history of the brain. Some years later, Carl Wernicke discovered that there was another area in another part of the brain which was devoted to language comprehension. But as a matter of fact, this is not a nice story. When Broca discovered this feature, the Académie Française, the Academy of Medicine, the French Academy of Medicine, awarded a prize of 500 francs for who had discovered exactly the contrary of what Broca discovered, because they did not like to accept the concept that the mind was in the brain. Even the Academy of Medicine, which was made by, of course, prominent scientists. So the discovery was so challenging that was, again, challenged by many, many others later on, but it was so important and it was real, it was true that that era was devoted to language production, that this was accepted later on. But only 100 years later, we understood how the brain is made microscopically. And this was due to the work of Santiago Ramón Cajal, the most important, at least to me, neurobiologist in the last century, because he discovered almost everything in the brain. And this picture is a drawing which was made by himself while looking at the microscope. And he could be so smart to exactly understand that the brain was made by cells that he called neurons, and the cells had antennas to receive signals, and the transmitter, which is called axon or fiber or nerve fiber, which is the transmitter. Okay? And he was so smart to understand that nerves were connecting each other through synapses. Synapses means, in Greek language, means conjunction. So synapses are molecular switches which are interconnecting neurons, nerve cells, one to each other to form circuits. Okay? So at the beginning of the last century, we knew a little bit about the microscopic structure of the brain. If you look at the brain in movement, as you see here, of course there are many other cells. You see the white cells is called myelin, are insulating fiber and insulating sheet, and you see these nice neurons which are transmitting electrical impulses. And the yellow one is the astrocyte, the star-like cells, which is supporting neurons. So nowadays we know something about the brain structures, because we know that the brain is weighing 1.5 kilogram more or less. It contains 90 billion cells. 90 billion cells are interconnected each other by 100 trillion synaptic connections, and we have more or less 1.5 million kilometers of fibers in our brain. And the most striking thing is the brain consumes very, very low quantity of energy, 20 watt, which is very, very low. It's like this one of these lamps. And this is interesting because from a computational point of view, the brain is much more powerful than any computer we have developed so far that consumes gigawatts, terawatt of energy. So trying to understand how the brain functions in terms of energy consumption would be the best way to try to solve the energy problem. And so now that we know a little bit more about how the brain is structured, it's interesting to understand how the brain works, because this is important. And how the brain works is very simple. Thanks to another Italian, Luigi Galvani, we had wonderful scientists in Italy until the end of the 800s, and then in the century later we lost everything, because, you know, in Italy science culture is not anymore interesting. It's much more interesting to have politicians not doing anything and just speaking every day about nothing. But that's another story. You may experience the same here. I hope not. But so in 1791, Luigi Galvani, which was an extraordinary scientist, Italian scientist, discovered that nerves and muscles are electrically excitable. He discovered that the language that the nerves use to communicate each other is an electrical language. And again, was a fantastic discovery. And this is the original picture. This is a frog, and he just connected a frog to a cable, and there was some thunderbirds which were able with electricity to make frog muscles contracting. Few years later, Fritz and few years later, 100 years later, two German scientists showed experimentally that if you stimulate electrically the cortex, the most outer part of the brain, you can make contralateral limb movement, because As you know, the right part of the brain control, the left part of the brain control the right part of the body, and the right part of the brain control the left part of the body, okay? So they discovered that just by stimulating one part of the brain, the limb, the contralateral limb, could move. So Galvani showed that electricity is the way nerves talk each other's, and these two gentlemen, German gentlemen, showed that this is important to make our body moving, okay? Few years later, when this was understood that the language of the brain was an electrical language, a technological system was developed that is called electroencephalographer, that you know, like EEG. And we understood that we could record from the brain this electricity, which was a sort of confirmation that the brain language is electricity. So now about brain functioning we know a little bit more because, again, we know that the brain is not a digital system. We are in a digital era. Everybody of us is using digital phones and everything, but our brain is analogic. It's very simple. It works with low energy, it's just analogics. So this means that probably we miss something, we don't understand something about that. It works by sending only the necessary signals. Each neuron is highly selective. It's operated at low voltage. The brain does everything as low as possible. Don't take this as an excuse for not doing anything, you know. The brain does a lot of things, but in a very efficient way. And the reason why it operates using very, very small quantity of energy is because it uses only a small fraction of their cells to make each operation, each function, less than 10%. So it does not too many things at the same time, okay? It uses this way of communicating, which is called sparse coding. But the point is, how can we combine structure and function? How can we understand apart from the motor system which are the part of what the different parts of the brain are doing really? And this has been possible in the last century thanks to the micro and micro imaging technologies which have been developed in order to look into the living brain, okay, the live brain, because of course until the last 20 years we were used to see the brain when the brain was already in autoptic material or bioptic material, already fixed, not living. And of course if you see something which is already dead, you can see something which is not real. While if you look at the brain while it is doing something, you can much better understand how it functions, but this is not easy. And however, we have been developed many, many different techniques, including computer tomography, magnetic resonance imaging, position emission tomography that you know for sure. And with this kind of technologies, we can look at the brain. However, we don't have enough sensitivity and specificity to look at the single cells, because the resolution efficiency is more or less 1 millimeter, in which there are millions of brain cells. Therefore, we can see what a brain region is doing, but not exactly what a single cell is doing. Nevertheless, with this kind of technique, with a magnetic resonance technique, for example, we can see when we move the left end, we can see in the cortical part of the brain, the part which is operating, so the part of the brain which is sending the message to the hand in order to make it moving. And the same is when we use the left hand, we see that the same is occurring in the right hemisphere. This is called functional imaging, and means that we can make people doing several things. And since the area in the brain which is operating that function is consuming more oxygen, we can imagine through MRI, through magnetic resonance imaging, this higher consumption of oxygen, and this is the reason why with this technique we can see, at least grossly, we can see what a single area of the brain is doing. So the next question, let me see, is the use of MRI has allowed us to understand how the brain functions in vivo, okay? And we understood that the brain is a complex network of circuits, which are very, very complicated circuits, as you can see here. And those circuits have certain hubs, so there are regions in the brain in which many, many different signals are converging. It's like airports, you know. There are important airports and there are less important airports, and the same is for the brain. There are hubs in the brain in which most of the signals are concentrated, and other part of the brain in which signals are not so much concentrated. At the same time, while studying the brain with functional MRI, there were people, in particular Erwin Nair and Bert Sackman, which were able to understand how to study single neurons, living single neurons, and they developed this technique which is called patch clamp technique. They got the Nobel Prize for that, in which you can, with a sort of electrodes, you can just get into a single neuron, and you can record. As you can see here, this is the electrodes, this is a living single neuron. You can record how the single neuron is working. At the same time, this was mentioned yesterday, at the same time, using lights, we can also study neurons while they are moving. And interestingly enough, using more or less those technologies, we discovered circuits in the brain, and the first one was this one, which was discovered by John O'Keefe in 1974, and May Britt and Edward Moser. They got the Nobel Prize last year. Probably you have been hearing about that because the news were used to say that they discovered the GPS of our brain, but as a matter of fact, what they discovered was, of course, fundamental, was the very first brain circuit making us capable of orienting within an open space. So again, they were able, after Broca, identifying the Broca's area, they were able to look and to find in vivo the first neural circuit making, you know, an operation which can be attributed to our mind. And what was discovered very recently was the Facebook effect, which was another interesting thing, because among neurons and among networks, it seems that neurons talk only with similar neurons, as we do when we create in Facebook, when we create lists. I don't know, I don't use Facebook, and probably list of friends which are very similar to us, which is much easier to talk with. And maybe Facebook has been invented just because it's been invented by the brain, which is using Facebook as a way to operate, which is interesting. And to make this circuit functioning, it was discovered that even in the brain we have stem cells, which are a sort of place producing new neurons, which are keeping our brain functioning in two areas, in particular in the hippocampus and in the basal ganglia. Keep to these two areas in mind, because I will talk a little bit about them even later. But what is extraordinary of this finding is that in the hippocampus there are stem cells which are changing the 2% of the total area of the hippocampus every year. And the hippocampus is the region of the brain in which we store our memories. So to keep our memories in our brain, we have to change the structure of the brain in which we keep memory. This is fantastic because we think exactly the opposite. We think that we should keep our memory in a very safe place, while this is not the case. So to keep our memory, we have to change continuously the cells which are containing our memories. And this is something that will be studied further in the future for sure. So just to summarize this part, we can say that the neurons form circuits which are interconnected via synapses, and each neuron can have from 1,000 to 10,000 connections with other neurons, and neural circuits interconnect different brain areas within which information are processed simultaneously. They can be processed both in series or in parallel, doesn't matter. Neural circuits are responsible for specific brain function and not the single neuron. And complex brain functions are the result of elementary functions carried out separately in different brain areas. So just to be clear, if I see my friend Macarena, I don't recognize her as Macarena. I recognize her voice, her face, her nose, her eyes in different areas, and then my brain makes a circuit, and from the circuit comes up Macarena as a person. Why the brain does in this way? Because if we damage a single area, we don't lose the complete circuit. We don't lose what we know about Macarena. If I lose the area in which I process her voice, I don't lose the circuit which tells me that she is Macarena. And this is, again, another fantastic way that brains operate to keep functioning. And then we know that to keep this neural circuit functioning, we need to generate new cells. And stem cells of the brain do generate new cells, 700 cells, 1,000 cells per day, to keep this system functioning. So, but the point now, and the question now, which is one of the most compelling questions or challenging questions we have to face, is the following. So, since our brain is made by circuits, are the number of circuits we have in our brain a finite number, which is set during development, or we can increase the number of our brain circuits over time? This is very important, of course, because for evolution, of course, we need to develop new circuits every time to confront with the environment which is changing, of course. Just a little bit of suspense, because this is a crucial question. Now I have to drink. So, and now we can try to give some answers to this question, which are not probably so nice as you would expect, because there are some works which has been done recently that demonstrate, for example, that foraging, so the way of looking for food, the neural circuit that we use, that worm use, that Drosophila, which is a fly, uses, that mouse uses, that non-human primates, monkeys use to look for food, is exactly the same circuit we use when we bet, when we make economic whatever operations. This is because, and the same is true for example, unfair offers, in monetary offers. We use the same circuit to refuse unfair offers that we used to sense disgusting food. Okay? So the concept, I will try to make it clear, is that during evolution we have developed a certain number of circuits. And for example, money are not part of the evolution. Money is something that we just discovered a few years ago. So the way we deal with money for the brain is not so essential. And therefore the brain is using the same circuit that it uses to deal with food for dealing with money. Therefore, when we are very angry, we are irrational, and we are irrational also when we play with money, unfortunately. And this is the reason why economists destroy our economy recently. And Einstein was used to say that economists have been invented to be pleased with astrologists, you know. because they really cannot predict too much. So, what about our irrational brain? Sorry, Julia, for Julia is my daughter-in-law, and she's an economist, and probably she's here, and probably tonight she will beat me. So that's the reason I have to ask excuses first. And that's the reason why our brain could be irrational. And in particular, could be irrational when we have to take fast decisions, when we don't have time. When we have to take fast decisions, we have to use those circuits which are preset and which are automatic, innate. This is, of course, just hypothesis because we don't know too much about the brain. Nowadays, we know how a brain for a worm works, so a brain of more or less 300 neurons. In 5 years, probably, we will know how a brain made by 15,000 neurons will work. In 10 years, probably, we will know about a brain which is composed by less than 1 million neurons working. In 15 years, probably, we will know about a 75 million neuron brain, which is the brain of the mouse. So our brain is made by 90 billion neurons. So going from 75 million to 90 billion neurons will take ages, probably, will take centuries, if we will be able to understand something about how our brain functions. So what I'm telling you today is where we are. So everything that you may listen about this issue, most of the time is not true, because we really know only small circuit as the one that I told you, how they work. We don't know anything about entire brains, and probably we will know about the way a mouse brain works in 15 years. So, but in the last part of the talk, I would like to tell you a little bit about how the brain defends ourselves, so how the brain is able to defend those circuits which are so precious for making us as we are. And from a teleological point of view, and this is clear now, the brain should be able to protect itself from any stressful event more than any other organ in the body. And the way the brain does this is the following. First of all, the brain is very well secured within the skull, is very well protected from meninges, which are layers of tissue which are surrounding the brain. Then the brain is immersed in a fluid which is called cerebrospinal fluid, which makes the brain not very attached to the skull. Otherwise, every time we had a bump with the skull, we would, of course, damage the brain. While the brain is moving, is freely moving within our skull a little bit. There are people probably in which the brain is too much, is moving too fast, but that's another question. And so it's insulated by barriers. Second issue is that the brain is patrolled by the immune system, the one I was telling you before. The immune system is also within the brain. White cells of the blood are circulating within the brain, looking around if there are stressful signals that should be taken care of, okay? If there is something strange which is not working properly, if there is some stressful event which is alerting the brain that there is something wrong that should be eliminated. But even more importantly is something which is quite new, because we recently discovered that neural stem cells are not only capable of producing new cells, but are only capable to protect the brain from stressful signals. In fact, some of those cells are located exactly in a very inner area of the brain, surrounding structures which are called basal ganglia and limbic system, that you may know about emotions, but limbic system is doing a lot of things. So you see, this is in this area there is the liquid, the fluid I told you before, from which everything coming from the periphery enters into the brain. So this is the interface between the environment and the tissue, okay? So exactly in this area we have stem cells surrounding this area, and therefore those stem cells are sensing stressful danger signal coming from the periphery, and they are able to block those stressful signals to avoid inflammation and to avoid damage, of course, as I told you before. And this is the so-called bystander effect that we have been able to describe some years ago. So stem cells in the brain protect from danger signals. Sorry, this is a little bit a busy slide, but don't worry, you don't need to read it. But what I would like just to say is that this barrier produces, for example, cannabinoids, vanilloids, or other substances which are able to block stressful danger signal outside the brain, not to make those signals enter in the brain when they are potentially damaging. And interestingly enough, it has been discovered recently that there is a region in the same area of the brain which is alerting the immune system from the periphery to get into the brain because there's something wrong. So the picture is the following. When something stressful comes from the outside to the brain, neural stem cells can sense this coming into the brain, and they, on one end, secrete substances to block this danger signal to enter the brain because it's potentially dangerous, and alert the immune system that something is going wrong, so the cells which are surrounding the brain are concentrating in the region from which the danger signals is coming. Interestingly enough, it seems that this operation is made also through the help of the microbiota that we have in our gut. In fact, we call it the gut brain. If we eliminate microorganisms from the gut, even our brain is less capable of taking decisions, but this could be the topic of another lesson or another talk because it's too complicated. But what is interesting is that in this system we have stem cells, and stem cells are protecting the most ancient place of our brain, which is the so-called reptilian brain, in which we have the surviving circuit I've been telling you before. In this area, we had the circuit for food, we had the circuit for reproduction, we had the circuit for defense. And therefore, the neural stem cells, which are in this sort of intermediate part of the brain, defend mostly those surviving circuits to function properly. And this is the reason why we are irrational is an additional reason, apart the number of affinity circuits for us to being irrational. This is very probable. Our brain is irrational because, again, when there is something which is threatening the brain, it has to operate very fast to eliminate it and to protect the brain. And therefore, this needs to be very fast in making actions is probably the reason why sometimes we are irrational, not only with money, but also in other things. But, of course, when danger signal, when the brain cannot take care of stress, cannot take care of inflammation, and the danger signal, the enemy still enters the brain and damages the brain is still in that situation able to try to repair the damage. This was already described in 1997 by Francisco Tello, which was a fellow of Ramon Cajal, but now we know that nerves might grow. 2 millimeters per day, small nerves, 5 millimeters per day, large nerves. This depends very much on the type of the nerve. Peripheral nerve, they grow much faster. Central nerves, brain nerves, they do grow less faster. Very slow, I must admit. So when nerves are injured close to the cell body, they do not regenerate. When nerves are injured near the end of the nerve, they do regenerate. But even more importantly, we can also change very fast connections. So when synapses are broken, and therefore neural circuits are broken, are damaged, we can very easily change connection very fast and very rapidly to make new circuit. So upon tissue damage, neurons change rapidly their connection with other neurons in order to form new functioning neural circuit and preserve brain function. This is just an example. This is an in vivo movie in which you see a synapse in red and the nerve in yellow, and the nerve fiber in red. you see this is this is a live imaging, so this means that those synapses are changing over time very rapidly, okay? And then this is a very nice way the brain uses to repair themselves. But which is the outcome of this activity? It's very simple, that the brain is plastic. This is an healthy brain, this is a magnetic resonance imaging. This is a brain in which we have a stroke. This is a stroke, a very huge lesions in an area which is devoted to make our hands freely moving. You see, this is the circulation, and there is a block of circulation here, and all this region is damaged. So what happens, fortunately, because as you know, 30% of stroke people recover completely, 30% recover partially, and only few percent die by stroke. So even stroke can damage a huge area of the brain. Brain functions are preserved, and the reason why, because the brain is capable of forming new circuits. This is the healthy brain, and this is the region that we use to move our hands, the right arm, okay? When we have a stroke in this area, what happens is that there are other areas of the brain which are recruited to overcome, to circumvent the circuit which has been lost, which has been damaged. So a sort of bypass. So there is an increase of this area, there is much more circuit which are now used by the stroke patient to still continue to move properly the right arm, because new circuits have been formed. The last part is about the origami effect, is about epigenetic. Can we change also can we change our capacity of sensing stressful event in the brain, of defending the brain, of repairing the brain due to our behavior? This is something we can do, but I have to tell you about the epigenetics, the origami effect. I mean, DNA, you cannot change the structure of DNA, but you cannot change the function by adding to the DNA few molecules or few atoms of carbons. So this means that even if you don't change the DNA, because the DNA cannot be changed, you can modify the function of DNA by adding some very small molecules. Those very small molecules come from the environment. So when we behave in a certain way, we can modify the functioning of our DNA. And as a matter of fact, what happens when you have early stress event in your early life, you change the part of the brain I've been discussing with you about, which is handling the stressful signal in the brain, in a sort of way that you are more prone to be stressed. So when your mom does not take care properly of you during your early life, you have much more probability to be a more stressed person in your adult life. And this is not magic. This is not because there's something supernatural or supranatural. This is just because there are some changes in your DNA which are very much depending on our behavior. So don't think that our behavior are nonsense. Whenever we behave and we interact with a person, we can make our DNA and the DNA of the person we are discussing about changing and changing function. And even more extraordinary is a very recent experiment in which it was demonstrated that if we traumatize a sperm and we use this sperm to generate a new offspring, the offspring that we generate with the traumatized sperm will be more susceptible to stress. Okay, so our behavior is also transmittable to progeny. Of course, I'm talking about studies which have been done in mice. So we should take those studies with caution, because they are not done in humans, although there are several psychological studies showing, epiphenomenically what I'm telling you now. But when you traumatize, when you make a mouse, when you make some stress to a mouse, not only the mouse itself is more stressed, but it can transmit this stressful to the progeny through the sperm. So the collective behaviors are fundamental to, to properly develop, to properly evolve as a society. This is the reason why that knowing science probably is the way, this is the reason why I like very much Puerto of Ideas and Science Festival, because we can transmit our attitude to increase knowledge, and increasing knowledge means to be much more equal and to create a more solidarity-based society. This is the reason why. So try to understand that your behavior is conditioning the behavior of the other people, even from a biological point of view. And but just in the last 5 minutes, few things about, I've been telling you a lot of things, but can we translate into concrete terms what I've been telling you about the brain functioning? Can we generate therapies to help people with neurological diseases since we know about the brain functioning, since we know at least a little bit about how the brain functions, because this is what we need. We need to take care of patients with neurological disorder, because this is a sort of disaster. 1 person out of 5, 20% of people in the world do suffer from a neurological disorder, from a brain disease. So we desperately need about therapies, okay, to try to. And we don't have too much, I must tell you. We don't have too much. But we start seeing something. I mean, knowing what we know about the brain function can tell us something. The stem cell field, for example, there are now 1,054 different trials with stem cells in the world, and most of them are, and not most of them, but few of them have been devoted to try to solve neurological disorders. We know now that when we take neural stem cells and we inject those neural stem cells into the brain and we transplant neural stem cells, we are able to make this stem cell doing many things, not only substitute the cells that have been damaged, but also to protect the cells of the brain, because as I told you before, this is what the stem cells do in the adult brain. So if you see a situation like this, in which we have a neuron which is damaged, we have the myelin which is damaged, we have the immune cells which are releasing toxic substances in the chronic inflammation, the inflammation which is bad, I was telling you before. And if we transplant neural stem cells, as you will see, we know now that neural stem cells can do a lot of things. You see the blue cells, the big one, which is a neural stem cells, entering into areas in which we have damage, and once they are in the area, what they do is to try to understand what is going on there, and they start secreting substances, for example, which are making myelin, which are reconstructing myelin. They can phagocytose, they can eliminate bad cells, bad immune cells. They can, for example, this is a scar made by astrocytes, the cells I've been telling you about before. They can eliminate scars, and some of the cells can transform into cells producing the insulator sheet called myelin in order to make neurons properly functioning. So stem cells seems to be very, very powerful, and nowadays what we know, what we are doing is a series of different clinical trials in patients already with different disorders, in which we inject stem cells, neural stem cells, in order to understand, first of all, if they are safe. Because if we inject stem cells, if we take care of the disease, but we generate tumors, we don't do our job properly. So since stem cells do many things, of course they are also dangerous as drugs. They can be beneficial, but at the same time they can have side effects, real side effects. So we have to play with these cells very, very careful. Don't go around to look for stem cell therapies if they are not proven, and there are no proven stem cell therapies so far, except for corneal injuries and for blood cancer. So don't go around, don't be cheated by stem cell tourists, by those kind of bad people offering you for money some stem cell treatment, because they don't work, and you can come back with a worse disease than the one you are looking for a cure. So nowadays we are at the very, very beginning with stem cells. We know very much about what they do. We are discovering even more now, but at the same time we have to be very careful because they can be dangerous. In a few years we will know more for sure. The second example I'd like to tell you is about the neural networks that I was referring to you about. We know how we produce the stimulus in our brain to make our limb moving, okay, as I told you before. We know exactly the circuit. So what John Donoghue did in the States was to record electrical activity from the part of the brain which is generating the impulse to make the limb moving, okay? He recorded with a simple electrode, he recorded the electrical impulses. Then he transformed those into algorithms and put this into a microchip, okay, which is very, very, very small. So this microchip is just transducing the electrical signal to a computer, and the microchip was injected into the brain of the person which is tetraplegic, which is not able to move their hands. And look at what this is called brain gate. So, and this is what we can do so far. This lady, which is tetraplegic because she had a spinal injury, cannot move their hand, she's thinking to move her hands, and she's moving these robotic hands just by thinking of doing it. And she can take this is something fantastic. It's really extraordinary to me. It's very, very primitive, of course, because the technology is not so sophisticated. But just by thinking of moving her limb, she can take the bottle and she can drink from the bottle. And so this is just because we know about the brain circuit, the motor brain circuit, how it works, okay? And probably in the future, if we will know more about how these circuits work, we could try to substitute, even with circuits like this one, some of the function we may lose. And look at the smile of this lady. She was not able to drink by herself from 20 years. And she's so happy to do that, that it's the most rewarding things for a scientist which is doing this for job. And is this what we are expecting in the future? Possibly. But still, we have a question in mind, which is a question that I would like to conclude at that, which is a fundamental question, which was a question that Primo Levi, which is a Jewish Italian writer, which was persecuted by Nazis during the Second Big War, wrote in honor of Rita Levi-Montalcini when Rita Levi-Montalcini got the Nobel Prize for the NGF, which is a factor which stimulates brain functioning. And he says a very simple thing, which is the question of the question. So if, and the question is, while doing this, we will take one step closer to the most evanescent and desirous aspiration of the human being, which is that of the human mind that understands itself. We will be able to understand, we will be able to make our brain understand how our brain functions? This is the real question. Maybe not, maybe yes. We have just to wait. Thank you very much for your attention.